Now let's discuss the part 3. If you remember in the initial introduction, in part 3 we'll be discussing institutional solutions for collective action problems. So in this part we'll be talking about how institutions can address the problem of commons, the problem of collective action for the governance of the commons. So in part 3 we'll be discussing about the third component of the theoretical approach, institutional solutions for the collective action problems for the commons. As we have discussed earlier, the collective action involves inputs and efforts of multiple individuals to achieve certain outcomes. And often, unlike private goods or services, it's difficult to exclude beneficiaries of the collective action even if they do not contribute to the collective action. So where the problem here? The problem arises as the individual who contribute to the collective action are likely to stop doing so, as they can also benefit like the non-contributors even if they do not contribute. So they do not have an incentive to contribute to continue with the collective action, and that's the collective action problem is all about. And the nature of this problem varies across different resource and different scales. It gets manifested in different ways. It could be small problems such as the local grazing land, something that we have already discussed, or local forest that involves few individuals. Or it could be the large systems like atmosphere and oceans that involve large number of individuals or multiple nation states. One of the example here is, for instance, the climate change, greenhouse gas emissions that causes climate change. So people often say getting the institutions right is the solution to address these collective action problems. So here when I say institution, what do I mean? By institution, I mean the constraints or rules that human beings devise to structure and regulate human interactions. These institutions could be formal, they could be informal. Some of the examples of the formal institutions are, for instance, our formal rules, our penal codes, constitution. These are all formal institutions. So informal institutions, they are the conventions, the norms that governs a society is something which are part of the informal institutions. Why these institutions matter? Why should we bother about institutions? Institutions matter because they ensure security of the property rights. They also helps enforcing the contracts. It also involves the coordination or the transaction cost involved for any two individuals, actors to interact. That way, that's something which fosters collective action. It also influences the preferences, the perceptions, the interests, the values that we have towards different things. It also influences the rationality type or the type of motivation. It also decides whether the kind of rationality that we should pursue should be I rationality or we rationality or they rationality, right? So the tragedy of the commons, for instance, is based on the I rationality, where I try to maximize my own benefit, but at the end I also lose out. We rationality suggests that we actually gain, like when we pursue that kind of strategy, something which can be influenced by the kind of institutional structures that we have. When it comes to environmental commons, given the complexities associated with use and conservation of these resources, it's also important to look beyond the institutions of market and state ownership. These are the two institutional mechanisms suggested by the conventional theories as the way to go ahead to address the tragedy of the commons as effective institutional arrangement. There is a need for diverse institutional arrangements that fits to the specific socio-ecological systems best for governing common pool resources. When it comes to institutional regime, it can take any form. Like for instance, let's talk about some idealized types. So the institutional structure here is set of rules for ownership and also use of the resources, and rules of interaction between actors with ownership or use rights. So if you look into the rows here, the rows here in this table talks about different types of interactions you have. The type of interactions among different actors could be market exchange. The interactions could be governed by the market rules. It could be governed by the command and control kind of regimes, governed by the rules, the policies legislated by the public authorities. It could be governed by cooperation or reciprocity, something which like through the community-based interaction that we refer to, or there could be cases where the interaction may happen without any defined rules. And when it comes to the property right, there could be private property, there could be state property, there could be common property, or there could be open access. So the institutional regime that I am referring to here can take any of these 16 cells that we have here. That means it could be private property kind of arrangement with market exchange. It can be private property kind of arrangement without no rules, without any rules defined. Similarly, it can be common property resource with no rules defined. It could be common property resource arrangement with like clearly defined rules for the cooperation and reciprocity, right? So it can take any of these 16 different forms. These illustration of these 16 different kind of possible boxes that I had shown you is a vast simplification of the kind of rules forming institutional regimes. Institutions that define ownership to and use of environmental resources would typically include a wide set of rules. That also includes conventions, norms and legal rules. So it goes beyond these property right, something that we have discussed in the section 1. It's essentially a bundle of rights. So institutions defining interactions between resource owners and users are also characterized by large variation. The interaction rules here concerns, like it may be the distribution of products from use of the resources, it could be the common use of resources, or it could be the treatment of the externalities, the side effects, the pollution or the effect of the harvest that you have. So institutional analysis and development framework is often used, often suggested as kind of analytical tool to design the right kind of institution. Given the complexity and diversity of the resource systems, it's important that the framework also contains a nested set of building blocks that social scientists can use in effort to understand human interactions and outcomes across diverse settings. As you can see, the external variables could be biophysical condition of the resource, attributes of the community that uses the resource, and the rules which is already in use to like concerning like use of that specific resource. So the other component here in this like IAD or institutional analysis and development framework is action situations. The action situations is nothing but the like an action situation here is comprises of two different things: actors and action situations. Action situations for all kinds of resources are certainly affected by these three external variables that we are referring to: biophysical conditions, attributes of the community, and rules in use. And this action situation in turn influences the interactions that happens between the actors and the action situation, something that gives us the outcomes. The outcomes again has implications on external variables, which again this kind of interaction that happens. So these tool can be a guiding kind of tool to design the right kind of institution to make the outcomes better, or to make the interactions kind of win-win situation. There has also been discussion on polycentric governance systems to address the problem of collective action in case of commons. Here, by polycentric governance systems, I mean a governance system with multiple governing authorities at different scales. So in this polycentric governance system, you have each of these governance units are independent within a specific geographic area or domain of authority, and they are also linked to each other. They are independent when it comes to the geographic area and authority, but they are also linked to each other, and so in that sense they are nested across the scales. The advantage of these polycentric structure is that it confers modularity. It can be modulated depending on the requirements, the way the requirements of the situation. It also performs a very important function which is called functional redundancy, right? The functional redundancy suggests if one layer of these governance systems, polycentric governance system fails or doesn't work, then other layers work as kind of like come forward to address these concerns. So polycentric governance, because it includes all different institutional mechanisms across the scale, it provides opportunities for enhanced learning and experimentation, and also it provides an opportunity to broaden and deepen the level of participation of all different kind of stakeholders involved. This polycentricity also helps capitalize on scale specific knowledge, like maybe some of these knowledge systems could be relevant, or the structure could be relevant for a specific scale. When you have a polycentric governance where independent authorities nested across scales, then we have this advantage of capitalizing on scale specific knowledge. This polycentric governance also have certain challenges. One of the major challenge is the choice of scale. There has been concern that if there is scale mismatch, right, of the kind of institutional regime that you are designing does not match the scale that it is dealing with, then we may end up in something which is which won't give us better outcome, because it involves various stakeholders and users. So the challenge also is to negotiate the trade-off between these different resource users and stakeholders, and coming to some kind of consensus about the outcomes or the pattern of defining the pattern of interaction. Sometimes there is also trade-offs between and across both scales and user groups, which makes this entire system bit more complex. But it's also important, if you want a very resilient governance system, then it's very important to also address these complexities, not shy away from that. So designing the right kind of institution provides us with the opportunity to deal with the problem of collective action. So before I close this lecture, let me summarize what we have discussed in part 3. The discussion in part 3 suggests that we need to look beyond the market, the private property institutions that we talk about, and also the solution of nationalizing the commons to address the problem of collective action, because both these institutional arrangements, be it market or the private property or the nationalization resources, has its own nationalization of the common property resources, has its own limitations. So the way to go is to explore diverse institutional arrangements that can address the problem of collective action and ensure efficient, effective governance of the common resources. So it's important to design the right kind of institution that fits to the socio-ecological context best, which can address the collective action problems in the context of these governance of these socio-ecological systems or the common pool resources. And some of the institutional arrangement that is being talked about are polycentric governance mechanisms, often also that's often also called collaborative governance mechanisms, to address these problem of collective action at different levels, and to ensure that all different institutions across the scales are working together to address the problem of collective action and ensure the sustainable management of the environmental commons, which is the need of the hour. Thank you so much for your patience listening.